Today in this third panel, right now, we're going to discuss the bilateral relationship between two countries since the July 15 coup attempt. We have, in the past 3 years, we had a dynamic relationship, but at the same time, this relationship has faced a lot of challenges. There's not only one dimension, we have different dimensions. Both countries are strategic partner. We have partnership. They continue to work in different areas. They continue to cooperate in different areas. And we have also trade and economy in this economic dimensions in this relationship. So today here to discuss with us, I'll start from my left side. Jennifer Miel from U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She's the executive director at U.S. Turkey Business Council, and also Professor Biral Akgün from Marif Foundation. He's the president of the Marif Foundation, and lastly, Mr. Doran, Michael Doran from Hudson Institute. So we will start with the general remarks. Then we're going to specifically discuss the issues one by one, and at the end we will try to answer the questions from the audience. I'd like to start actually from Mr. Doran. Tell us about the security concerns of both countries. Tell us about how the Trump administration approached these security concerns of Turkey.
Thanks for having me today. Until today, I think we had a story that was getting better and better, but I'm afraid with the arrival of the S-400s, I think we're about to go into a crisis. So let me start with the good news story and then the crisis. The good news story actually started with bad news, and that is that under President Obama, the U.S. put together this counter-ISIS strategy that we all know led to an alliance with the YPG, PYD, which is the Syrian extension of the PKK. And the U.S. ran roughshod over the Turks when they expressed their concerns about this. I mean, they said it was temporary, tactical, and transactional, the American relationship with the PYD, YPG. But the Turks feared, in my view, legitimately feared, that this was going to turn into a permanent, long-term relationship between the United States and would result in the creation of a Kurdish statelet in northeast Syria. Now, I don't believe that the Americans ever had that intention in their mind, but the actions that they were taking were leading in that direction, I think, almost inevitably. And so it's, I think, completely reasonable that the Turks would have been as concerned as they were. I think when the Trump administration came in, it continued its inclination was to continue the Obama policy, simply because the president had promised a swift end to the fight against ISIS. But there was a gradual recognition in the Trump White House, in particular, that this relationship with the YPG, PYD that was supposedly temporary, transactional, and tactical was leading to a strategic rift with Turkey. And I think that over the last year, a lot of efforts have been made to reduce the tensions with Ankara and to arrive, if not at a strategic accommodation between the two, at least an understanding of a path that will lead to accommodation. And that's where the good news story was, I believe. Unfortunately, I think with the arrival of the S-400s, I think we're going to enter into a crisis now in relations, because I think both sides don't have a lot of flexibility on this issue, and I think there's going to be there's going to be a clash. So, for those of us who believe that the strategic relationship between Turkey and the United States is vitally important to the interests of both countries, I think it's important for us to do what we can to minimize the damage that this clash is going to do. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves up front, and we have to say that there's definitely going to be a clash here. I can't see the Trump administration backing away from its position. It can ameliorate, accommodate to a certain extent the damage, but the administration is concerned has a number of concerns, but one I think is paramount in its mind is that if the Turks take possession of the S-400s, then there are a string of other countries waiting in line, and the Russians will end up undermining the American security system in the region. So I think they have to hold fast to this, and I would just advise our Turkish friends to have a similar attitude from the other side, which is, okay, the clash is coming. How do we minimize the damage and then start to unwind this so we can get back on a path to finding a strategic accommodation? Because that is, if I read the Trump administration correctly, I think that is their deepest intention. So the question is, can we minimize the retaliation so that we don't end up with a permanent separation? I think that would be bad for both sides.
Thank you very much for your comments. Ms. Miel, can you please talk about the different side of the relationship, trade and economy? Can you explain your introductory remarks?
Sure, of course. So I'd offer a counter to the temporary, transactional, and what was the other T? Tactical. Okay. The U.S. Turkey business relationship is dynamic, it's diversified, and it's durable. And we have seen really since, the title of this talk today is, what are U.S. Turkey relations like since 2016 and the July 15th coup attempt? I remember being in Turkey on July 14th with a delegation of some businesses, U.S. businesses. We were meeting with Turkish ministers and the presidency about how to break Turkey out of the middle income trap. So we had a lot of discussions on strategic sectors like healthcare, digital economy, and that next day, July 15th, that evening, was one of the most horrific and tragic evenings. But U.S. businesses, for a lot of the criticism that U.S. government gets about not responding, U.S. businesses responded immediately. Our companies were calling their staff to make sure everyone was okay. They were providing support networks. They were working with Turkish authorities to make sure the Ataturk airport was back up and running, also financial markets back up and running that Monday. So really, U.S. businesses responded immediately to the July 15th coup attempt to ensure there were no production gaps and really to take care of their employees. And that includes a lot of the CEOs and corporates in the United States to make sure everything was okay with their Turkish affiliates. And we look at the trade data as well from 2016 until present day. And if you're a trade analyst looking at the data, there's not much difference. We've actually seen an increase from about $17 billion to now we're at roughly $21 billion. So definitely the U.S. business relationship is a pillar that's strong and one that we can stand on. So I'll speak a little bit more about that in the introductory remarks. Also want to speak to the elevation of trade and commercial relations in presidential dialogues, so between President Trump and President Erdogan. And then lastly, talk a little bit about how we can overcome this period and the challenges that are to come, specifically looking at business and commercial relations. But back to the point about the strength of U.S.-Turkey business relationship. So we have about 1,800 U.S. companies in Turkey. This includes U.S. subsidiaries, JVs, any direct investments, or Turkish companies with U.S. capital. So the footprint is quite large. There's also about 60 U.S. companies, most of them multinationals, that are based out of Istanbul and use Istanbul as a hub for the region. When you look at all of their indirect and direct employment, it's about 100,000 Turks. There are some expats there as well, but the vast majority of employees that U.S. Companies have in Turkey are Turkish. They find immense value in hiring Turkish employees. They're some of the best and the brightest. We hear time and time again from U.S. companies and their leadership in the U.S. In addition to the approximate $20 billion trade volume, there's $5 billion in services that are traded between U.S. and Turkey, and another $9 billion of exports that are from U.S. companies based in Turkey to third countries. So one of the often cited areas of cooperation that we see as undervalued and far below its potential is third country cooperation. And we're already doing $9 billion, so it's about another doubling of Turkey's exports when you look at about $10 billion of exports going to the U.S. The trade relationship is also quite balanced, especially as we've seen over recent years, the foreign exchange rates making Turkish demand for Turkish exports in the U.S. increase. On the other hand, it's become more costly for Turkish companies to import many U.S. products, but through joint production and through a lot of partnerships, U.S. companies are still finding ways to do business in Turkey and even use that to their advantage by opening up some new factories or plants in Turkey and use the country as and labor force and talents to their advantages as a jumping point for both Europe, Middle East, and also Central Asia. Some of the partnerships are ones many of you know very well, Boeing and Turkish Airlines, or Ford Otosan and Coach Holdings. PepsiCo has 6 plants in Turkey. So there's a lot of U.S. companies that are doing great work with their Turkish partners, and we think there can be a lot more done. To the second point, we've all witnessed over the last probably about 8 months or so a heightening of dialogue amongst both President Trump and President Erdogan about the commercial relationship and trade relationship. This really all started with President Erdogan's first visit to the United States in 2017 under the Trump administration and discussions that they had about increasing trade in both energy and also defense. So we've seen this blossom now until a 75 billion trade volume goal, which was now up to 100 billion, as President Trump had stated during his G20 remarks. And something really interesting about the G20 remarks that President Trump had stated, the first words out of his mouth were about trade. You know, everyone had their eyes on the S-400 question, CATSA, but the first thing that he brought up was trade. I think it's important to see the lens through which President Trump views trade and views a lot of the military sales. It's both about security and it's also about procurements and U.S. jobs and U.S. exports. So the 100 F-35s and potential Patriot sale to Turkey would mean hundreds and thousands of U.S. jobs and billions of dollars of U.S. export volume. And I think that's still a strategic priority for this administration to make happen. So maybe there will be some type of strategic accommodation. The incentives are definitely there for both sides. So as we have this $75 billion goal amongst the presidents, it's very important now that business communities look to put together plans and to achieve this goal. It was really music to the business community's ear to hear the $75 billion goal first put out and now a $100 billion goal, because for far too long it had been very difficult to get trade and commercial relationship elevated to the presidential level. There were just too many very serious security and diplomatic concerns that had to be addressed, and we could never get our presidents talking about the economy. But as we know, both leaders are very ambitious. And with this trade goal, perhaps we can also fast track some reforms that can open up new opportunities and new markets for different products and different services. So that brings me to the third point of how are we going to overcome this period where we're expecting potential sanctions through CATSA. One important distinction to make is that CATSA is not targeting Turkey. Same thing with sanctions for Iran oil and also with tariffs that we saw that are still in place for steel and aluminum. Turkey is caught in the crossfire of these policies that are meant to achieve certain foreign policy or economic policy outcomes. Turkey is not the target. As such, we should be doing more strategic planning to overcome this period, especially looking at the economic relationships, as President Trump has also prioritized. So what can we do in this matter? Well, we can launch a U.S. Turkey commercial a dialogue at a high level, so cabinet secretary to a Turkish minister, and ensure that they meet every year, especially looking at Turkey's economy being very top-down decision-making. We need to engage at the highest level if we're going to see some positive change and reform. We can also look toward a potential visit for President Trump to Turkey and have a presidential summit, and specifically have a summit on the economy where cabinet secretaries are there and we can task out certain policy reforms that will be able to bring about effective change. Because really at this stage, policy making is deal making. We're not going to see a huge increase in investment in Turkey unless we have some policy reforms undertaken that will facilitate that flow of investment. Plus, no one has the time to have individual meetings all the time to be able to facilitate individual companies' investments. This will bring about a huge amount of FDI increase into Turkey. And likewise, for Turkish companies that are looking to do more in the United States, we need to do better at setting them up with different distributors, wholesalers, and really take different sectors such as automotives, textiles, aviation around the United States and meet with strategic partners in specific regions. So I'll end there, but look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Neal. Professor Akın, can you tell us about the Turkish perspectives? How do they see, how the Turkish president or the Turkish government sees the current U.S.-Turkish relationship?
Thank you, Seta, for inviting us to organize such a wonderful event to discuss at the very timely period in this critical juncture between the Turkey and U.S. relations. I prepared a lot of, paper here to discuss, but I will just briefly somehow discuss how we see from Turkish perspective as well. Just reminding, when I first came to United States in the 1990s, you will see only maybe a couple of times a year in American newspapers, any news piece in the Washington Post or New York Times once or twice a year. But nowadays, it's almost on the headline of agenda. So it become much more popular to discuss Turkish-American relations because of the complexities and deepening strategic relations, perhaps on the some problematic area. That's one of the perception. But this is not new. Even in the beginning of the 2000s, I do remember some of the articles like Ayan Lester's book, Turkish-American Relations in the Turbulent Times, a Rand Corporation report, or Who Lost Turkey discussion early in 2000 because of the non-cooperation between Turkey and the US when it was the American invasion of the Iraq, and then how to regain Turkey by Philip Gordon again in the 2007. So it's not new. This kind of discussion. What I really, emphasize here, Turkish-American relations in the last 7 decades somehow evolved and deepened and extended, just not from the security areas to the different area of cooperation, as just Jennifer pointed out, in different aspects of this economic and trade issues. Now, a total of $25 billion. This is not really a bad situation in terms of understanding the daily business. Even in the last 3 years, in the just aftermath of July 15, the business as business, not just for the strategic weapon system, but for the ordinary trade, for the goods and service trade, it is flourishing, and there has been a good connection between on the both sides. So that's really nothing really to worry about. For the bilateral relation, business is always a business. That's good to understand each other's position. Third, in terms of shared values and interests as well, for the general structure of the relations, both countries share all interests of the democracy, peace, and stability, as Minister Eker just discussed in the previous discussion here, and everybody knows. Even in the worst scenarios of the Syria, Turkey and America need each other. This is the most important point that was also discussed in the first panel here with regard to the Syrian issue. And third one, despite all these very hot issues and strategic discussion on Turkish media, blaming, exchange of views, etc. Diplomatic and political channels are always open. That is an asset. Even the most popular leaders of today, in Trump and Erdogan, you can discuss your leadership somehow, but they are always on the phone, talking each other, discussing every day and everything that they can discuss. So I think it's good to have such a connection in very critical times. So we don't need to be pessimistic, but we have to realize that there is a concern here. There are problems that need to be solved out. There are different understanding of the issues at the agenda of the bilateral relations, and how can we overcome. That is, you have to focus on for our future. Some people in the newspaper say that, okay, as if a slow motion car crash is coming. Yes, there's a crisis, no denying all that, but channels are open, everybody calculating each other's position, to what extent they can go to in terms of find a solution. So on both sides now, I mean, at the highest level of the leadership in both countries, recognize the importance of the bilateral relations for the long-term peace, stability, and security of not only the region where Turkey is located, but as a part of global governance system. The international system in the last 2 decades seems to be really changing from a unipolar world to the one that multipolar world that international politicians nowadays, academia in international politics are discussing. Not only the international system itself in terms of international political economic structure is in the process of transforming, but also the leadership and the politics perception of the both countries. I mean, both in the United States and in Turkey, these countries also trying to redefine and reorient themselves into the new realities of the world politics. So it's also producing some new understanding and divergence and critical area between Turkish and America. So this discussion cannot be just discussed in the context of on the bilateral relations. That's my point. It must be put into the larger context that each side actually redefine their position in the international politics. America, under the leadership of the Obama, decided to somehow withdraw from the activist policy that has been the case since 1945 as a leader of the Western world, or as the leader of the global hegemonic system, to the one that America now, under the Trump administration especially, recalibrating its position to be as a kind of nation state, the strongest state, but still accepting the reality that American people are not anymore willing to share the burden of global leadership, because it is becoming a costly for America because of the overextension and overstretch of American leadership in the world. So this is how it's happening, and within this discussion, America, when it comes to American position, it's not the having problem in redefining its relation with Turkey, but it's always everywhere with China or Iran is different case, but with even the long-term alliance of European countries. So Turkey is perhaps a little extreme case in the tense relation between America and the rest of the world, but it is not the unique, or it is not the only problematic area that we have to recognize it. Same thing applies to Turkey as well. I mean, when the Turkish-American relation was established in the 1950s, of course, Turkey was much more weaker and much more vulnerable against the just imminent threat of the Soviet Union. But over time, the strategic environment has changed, especially after the Cold War era. Turkey is now extending its network and foreign policy dimensions, including all countries, 360-degree, whatever available in the region, previously not accessible to the Black Sea or the northeastern part of the ex-Soviet territories. Now we have good relation with the or the rest of the world, even with the Russia, the most important case, which is also a concern for America. At this first time, I mean, the Turkish, Russian economic ties are, in terms of volume of trade, is stronger than between Turkey and the United States. So it has some economic and also energy political aspects as well. And we are very much energy dependent. America is becoming an independent in energy, which is now much on the agenda of America. Maybe Middle East and Iran or Russia in terms of energy politics is not really a concern, but for us it is concern. That's why we have to look for oil resources in the Mediterranean Sea. That is also creating some problem with our allies with the EU or America or our friends in Cyprus and Greece. So, but we, as a nation state, almost 90% depend on energy to the Russia or the Iran, which are also problematic internationally. We have to look for some oil resources, and what we need is an acceptance or understanding from our Western allies, including the United States. So if we look at the agenda today between American and Turkish relations, yes, there are problems. We have the YPG, we do have the Syrian crisis, we do have the S-400, F-35, FETÖ issues. But despite all these difficulties, we do have experience how to deal with each other without using of the threat language. That is a red line. We don't need to use the threat line, but as democratic countries, each other in each capital and leadership understand how this political business can be dealt with. Just coming to conclusion, I will just use a metaphor. One observer of Turkish-American relations cites that it is like a very exciting horror tunnel, fear tunnel in a Disneyland. It's an amusement park. You get into the dark area, ups and downs, some monsters, etc. But at the end of the day, you will end up with smiling face. So following the Turkish-American relations are always exciting, but certainly as long as there's a communication, diplomatic channels, good intention, we can somehow find a common solution to the hot issues or strategic cooperation for these hard times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Akın. Thanks a lot for your overall picture. And it's really important to understand this relationship in the light of regional and international problems. So I'd like to turn to Mr. Doran. Feel free to respond to the comments from Professor Akın and Ms. Miel. So, but the question that I want, or the point that I want to make is here too. We have the threat languages in the United States. We hear the language that are threatening the Turkish government, and also that we have like President Trump remarks on how he understands Turkey is concerned. So how do you explain this thing? So how do you see this?
It's a very easy question. Well, I can only interpret it, the different tones that we're seeing, and I think it's a quality of President Trump writ large, that he likes to have good personal relations with anyone that he's dealing with. I mean, this is why the North Korean leader is one of his best friends. He wants good relations with Vladimir Putin. I think he has a theory of the negotiations with partners, both friends and adversaries, that at the highest level you keep all of the channels open, and you show goodwill, and you let others fight it out below. So it's good news that he's sending the signals that he's sending, but I wouldn't read too much into it. And we've seen, we've seen over the last year or two, lots of cases. The most striking one was after the conversation with President Erdogan. President Trump said that we were going to pull out of Syria, and then the decision evolved. Now, I don't think it evolved in a way that made the Turks unhappy, but there's clearly a difference between the top line message and what results from it. The same is true, I think, on the case of Gulen. I think my understanding is that President Trump has time and again shown concern, consideration to the issues raised by President Erdogan, but there hasn't been a lot of clear development there. So I certainly hope that the end of the train is going to be smiling faces, but I'm concerned. I'm concerned. I'm not pessimistic, but I'm very concerned. I'd feel a lot better about it if some of the major issues between the two countries were already settled. If we had an agreement on the safe zone in northeast Syria in particular, I mean, I don't know exactly where those discussions are. My understanding from talking to people who are involved in them is that things have moved along considerably, and that there's reason for optimism, but there are still significant differences. If this S-400 issue was coming at a moment when there was already agreement, I'd feel a little bit better that smiles were where this was all going to end up. My fear is that on the Turkish side, there have been a lot of fears that the United States has a clear anti-Turkish agenda and a clear plan that it was carrying out. I mean, that's the Turks' worst fear. I know that's not the case, but there are a lot of elements in the government that are no longer sympathetic to Turkey. For me, the striking thing between the way things were 15, 20 years ago and the way they are now is, for instance, in the U.S. military, there used to be really significant reserves of pro-Turkish feeling, and a lot of that has gone away. I mean, in the counter-ISIS network that we created, there's a lot of hostility to Turkey. So I think that the goodwill in the White House is extremely valuable. I think it's sincere. I think the goodwill in the State Department is sincere. I think that Jim Jeffrey absolutely believes in the value of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. I think Ambassador Satterfield absolutely believes in it and wants to further it. But there's a lot of issues yet to be resolved. So my fear with this crisis that's coming over the S-400s is that it could have all kinds of reverberations through other areas and make all of these other areas more difficult to solve rather than easy. That's why I think we need to work to contain it.
Thank you very much for your answer. Professor Akın, would you like to give a response? Or?
I do agree to some extent in the matter of especially S-400. This is not easy to American special institutions, the hardcore security institution, to swallow, to understand Turkish position. But perhaps we have to work harder to further understand each other in the case that yes, Turkey is a NATO country, and NATO certainly provides an umbrella for territorial security, but in today's multi-dimensional security-wise, we need our own concern, especially for long-range missile system. And as President Trump just accepted last week, yes, first Turkey come to here in Washington to want to buy Patriot system, but unfortunately, the institution, especially Congress, was not willing to let the presidency to sell the weapon system. And if you live in Turkey yourself, you have to find a way to somehow obtain a long-term missile system. And we also somehow bargained with China that we decided not to. And then it was very much a rational business deal in terms of buying what you need as a strategic weapon system for your own security. This is the story of the issue. Yes, we have to understand each other, and we need more talks and more communication with not only the political wise, and I'm sure, and there has been a lot of bilateral visit by the Minister of Defense of Turkey to Washington and Pentagon as well to explain that we really would like to continue working with America on it is on military matters as well. But perhaps, yes, we will have some kind of hardship. I don't want to say crisis, but I don't wish, and we don't want to see a crash. That must be a controlled stop. Hopefully, that is what we expect with regard to S-400 crisis.
All right. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd like to turn to Ms. Meal. You actually point out and explained very well that actually there are a lot of things went in a better position in terms of the business. There's a lot of effort to bring the business back after July 15. So can you please talk about, and also you mentioned the dialogue actually that perhaps solved the problem that can emerge after a potential sanctions. So can you please elaborate on the dialogue between the business communities of these countries?
Sure. So there definitely is a robust dialogue going on between Turkish business community, U.S. business community, Turkish government, U.S. government, and then between both business communities and the respective governments. Many of you in the room were probably at the U.S. Turkey annual conference this year. It was more successful than ever in many respects. High-level participation from Turkish Minister of Trade, Turkish Minister of Finance and Treasury, Turkish Minister of Defense, several other Turkish officials, including the presidency spokesman. And also looking at the U.S. side, there was presence there by Secretary of Commerce and Senior Advisor to President Jared Kushner, as well as other officials throughout the government, including Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. I think that gives us confidence and reassurance that despite what crisis may be ahead of us, that there's a strong willingness from both sides to continue this dialogue. The dialogue I mentioned that could follow or proceed if there are CAATSA sanctions evoked would be something looking at U.S. Turkey jobs and exports. What are the strategic sectors that will bring about the biggest impact for Turkish job creation, U.S. job creation, and then also the exports to and from each country, and as I mentioned, also third country. So this is something that can be looked at and analyzed. The business communities are already undertaking extensive reports to highlight target sectors. I've never seen both governments engaged in such sincere dialogue to help out the respective private sectors as this moment, and heard the same from government officials as well. Was in Ankara about a month ago and had a lot of these discussions, and it was really encouraging to see how aligned the Turkish government is both with the U.S. government and also within itself. So you go to different ministries and everyone's reading off the same page of music. Talk to the U.S. government, the same thing. So at least on commerce and trade, it looks like we're doubling down and looking to invest time and effort to be able to see some concrete outcomes and help rebalance what has traditionally been a relationship looked at in defense and civil aviation, and looking to deepen in more sectors such as energy, digital economy, healthcare, agriculture. So maybe this can be the silver lining for the next 6 months, that we're going to target more strategic sectors that have been traditionally undervalued.
Thank you very much for your response. So going back to one of your stories, whether good or not maybe, but so you mentioned, Mr. Doran, sorry, you mentioned that both sides have limited flexibility to solve the problem, but nevertheless we can minimize the damage to this relationship. So I'd like to know about this limited flexibility, or who creates this limited flexibility. How about the role of the Congress? How do you see the role of the Congress in this crisis situation?
That's one of the issues about the S-400 question is it has a great political symbolic um, valence, and it's one of these issues that when the United States and Turkey are negotiating about the safe zone in northeastern Syria, it's not an issue that anyone is paying close attention to politically. People who are interested in international relations and strategy, they're aware of it and they know what's going on, but it isn't something that is grabbing their imagination. When Turkey develops a defense partnership, technology partnership with Russia, that suddenly that elevates it to a political level. The Hill gets involved. There's an unprecedented level of hostility to Turkey on the Hill, whether rightly or wrongly. I think it's just a statement of fact. And then that means that suddenly this issue becomes a question. When President Trump is talking to senators, he's got to explain his position on Turkey, and so it just becomes a much more complex issue because it can't be dealt with by just a few officials working with a few Turkish officials. It's now a big public issue, and there's as you know, in our politics today, there are few issues that are more polarizing and controversial than the whole Russia question. And it calls in there again, rightly or wrongly, a view has taken root in Washington and on the Hill in particular that Turkey is no longer an ally. It amazes me when I talk to people in the military, on the Hill, in the think tank world. They will say openly, Turkey's not an ally. Why is Turkey in NATO? Now, I don't agree with these positions at all, but we have to be aware that they are very widespread. I've never seen anything like it. Again, I do think it's short-sighted, but that is the reality. So this S-400 issue, it plays right into that mentality. That's the problem with it, and so it makes it that much harder for the administration to simply contain it, deal with it bilaterally, quiet things down, because other people are going to take it and run with it.
All right. Thank you very much for your answer. Professor Akin, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I do understand the perception of Turkey is changing in the United States, but also in other parts of the world as well, because the world itself is changing, and the partnership and alliance system in different parts of the world has been redefined. And for America, yes, we know how to work together under the structure of the bipolar system when it was the West versus the Soviet Union. But we don't know, I mean, how we cooperate with America, and America does really, from time to time, understand what kind of difficulties we are passing through in this part of the world, which means where Turkey is located in the front of the Europe and in the most volatile region of the Middle East. So it creates a lot of tension, and sometimes here people are ready to discuss easily to just discard okay, this as an old allies. But I don't find it is realistic to just saying that Turkey is not anymore an alliance system. No, Turkey is still a valuable alliance that serves in the best interest of the West period. The West period, because if it wasn't Turkey when it comes to Syrian refugees, we will see now not just Brexit, but many exits from the EU. If EU and your security will be collapsed, then transatlantic security arrangement, which means NATO, will not be as strong as today. And when it comes to early 2000s, I mean, when the 9/11 happened, it was Turkey that showed its solidarity with the West in the discussion of this clash of civilization and other issues, and fighting against the extremism and terrorism on the basis of the Daesh-like organization. It was Turkey as a Muslim democratic country sided with the United States. Now still in Afghanistan, just I visited last month, still in the military bases, every day on the routine basis, we are working with America. It same apply to in case of Balkans, in Kosovo, and some other critical matters. So just discussing on the hot issue on politically, yes, there has been discussion, but on the cooperation and on the security matters in almost every part of the world, Turkey is acting together with the United States. When it comes to Syria and Iraq, Turkey is playing a stabilizing factor, not destabilizing factor, and fighting against the ISIL together with the America. It was Turkey opened its airspace after the invasion of Iraq, and today Incirlik Air Base is serving in the best interest of the American military operations, and not only for the aircraft but drone operations as well in fight against the ISIS in Syrian landscape. So we cannot ignore all these elements within the cooperation. But again, I am yes, realist to understand that we need more to convince each other position in the reorientation of our country's strategic identity in the world system. That is always will be problematic to recognize our positions. And one thing is also helpful for us within all this environment, we are rediscovering the value of this strategic alliance. So I don't really, find this argument more, reliable or truthful to better describe the real situation. But yes, if there is a discussion in Washington D.C., we have to take care of this issue by communicating, open diplomatic channels. If lobbying requires or media reaching out to media, etc., we have to do more on both sides, and maybe on the multiple channels might be used and should be used to better explain each other's position. That might be much helpful to mitigate all this kind of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's turn to the audience. Anyone who willing to ask a question, please raise your hand, and there will be a mic come in. Please, we can start with you.
Hi, I'm Cristina Garcia Ayala. I'm with the ITA. I want to ask about Huawei. Granted, the US has identified Huawei as a major security threat, while Turkey houses its second largest tech center. Where do you see business relations between the two countries going, especially when it comes to cyber tech and 5G, and what can we do to consolidate being on opposite ends when it comes to Huawei? Thanks.
All right, thank you. So anyone willing to?
Jennifer,
please. Sorry.
Okay, well, just to qualify, I'm not a China expert, but US policy seems to be quite clear in foreign countries about utilizing Huawei technology for 5G networks. There are US alternatives. There are also ongoing talks between US and Chinese officials to make some accommodations for US companies that are now getting licenses to do business with Huawei again. After G20 meetings, there's definitely been some positive exchanges between US and China about solving this issue. As far as 5G networks go for critical infrastructure, I know the US position is that there could be a backdoor to some of these communications, and they're not as secure as the user would like. So it's ultimately in Turkey's decision what to do. But I know US favors developing 5G technology with its partners. So it would definitely be an area to discuss, and one that is currently under consideration through a governmental mechanism that was recently launched between US and Turkey on digital dialogue.
Any other questions? So please, sir.
I preface this comment by saying the same thing could be asked about our administration, but not whether Turkey is a legitimate ally, but whether it's still democratic. And if you compare the Putin playbook of extending your term limits by changing the constitution, imprisoning your political opponents, firing publishers, and people, 150,000 people, I think is the total. And the brutality that happened when Erdogan visited Trump on Massachusetts Avenue, that people with the phone videos saw was instigated by Mr. Erdogan himself. How do we respond to that and reassure people that even though you have a one-man rule now, that Turkey still eventually will arc back to the democracy of Ataturk?
Mr. Akın, would you like to?
Is there a comment or question? I'm not sure about, but just to say that my interpretation, yes, Turkey is still a strong democracy and has been a democracy in this part of the world since 1946. And even if you go back to some experience of democratic rules and constitution, you can get it back to in the late 19th century. The first constitution was accepted in 1876. So we have one of the longest experienced countries in terms of popular rule and constitutional government. Having said that, I mean, of course, Turkey has had some problems in the past in terms of interruption in democracy through the military coups or coup attempts, starting with the 1960, 1980, and now most recently July 15. So when it comes to these kind of most security, hard security issues, yes, sometimes democratic rules and norms cannot be real as freely as applies, and you need to somehow rule out, announce the emergency rules. I remember back in 2001 in America, I have lived 6 years in this country, and it was the golden years of democracy and globalism and liberal world under the leadership of Bill Clinton in the 90s. When I will look at today's America, you have, for instance, Homeland Security, most of the intelligence groups, and a lot of security-wise ruling acts, bills have been accepted, a lot of checks, etc. So the pendulum of the democracy and expansion of the promotion of democracy on the agenda of both on the real politics and the academic area seems to be unfortunately declined in the last 2 decades. If you look at the Freedom House reports, it says the same things. But we shouldn't be really in a hurry to judge countries' performance in different contexts. When it comes to Turkey, I think we should understand that we have really experienced one of the hardest security and state security crisis in July 15, 2016. This is part of the issues, and as Minister Akar also just touched on the issue. Turkey since then has been restructuring its government system as well, from parliamentary democracy to the American-style presidential one, and now there's been a lot of reform and discussion to reconsolidate after this crisis. And still, in the time of these last 2 years, we had 3 elections, and it has been competed with different candidates, everybody who would like to run. And in the last election, you all observed, I mean, in Ankara and Istanbul were won by the opposition. So I think we have to be more strategic, we have to show more strategic patience to judge the Turkish democracy for the long term. And even in these cases, I mean, if you go to public opinion polls, people certainly believe 95% the democracy is the only way and the method that we should define how we have to govern. And in terms of democratic agenda, nowadays still there is a growing demand and intention on part of the government and opposition as well. Perhaps in the near future, we hope a new resurgence of democratic movement in Turkey after we recover from all these crises. But please keep believing in Turkish democratic resilience. That is what I would say.
Thank you very much for the message. And is there any other question? Please, ma'am.
Ricarda Henke from the German Embassy. I wanted to ask if the US imposes sanctions on Turkey. If S-400 is delivered, what do you think? What kind of sanctions is it going to be? Like only on certain companies or also on the trading partners of Turkey?
Thank you. Ms. Miel, would you like to take the answer? Take the question?
So it's unclear at the current juncture, but if you look at the CATSO law, there are sanctions that there's 12 menu of sanctions. 5 of those need to be applied, and president and administration has their discretion. There have been recent reports saying that there would likely be secondary sanctions that would apply to Turkish companies or Turkish CEOs of those companies that are involved with the acquisition and installment of S-400. That's the approach. It's similar to the Iran sanctions waiver approach, where you're incentivizing or disincentivizing companies to do business with that entity to achieve a certain outcome versus sanctioning a government. There's only been one instance where CATSA has been utilized, and that's with Chinese company for purchase of Russian military equipment. And in that case, it was the CEO of that entity and also that entity. So we don't know, but we can look at some cases and some signals that are being sent.
Mrs. Ram, would you like to add, Mr. Ram?
No,
Okay.
I think that's as much as I could say.
Then let's get it to the audience. Are there any other questions before we close the panel? All right. That was a great debate, fruitful debate, actually. I'd like to thank you all for coming here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.